in advance what will be. And Agile is just a way to deal with that. And Scrum is one of the methodologies that has been put together to make that possible within a project. Okay, and that's very important, because this essential assumption is really at the core, at the heart of what we are doing here. You don't know what you will need in 6 or 12 or 5 months from now, or in 5 years from now. Okay, and that's not a reason for not doing anything. We still want to move forward, but you have to move forward while accepting the idea that we don't know what we will need in the future. Okay, does that make sense? And so Scrum is a very simple project methodology, and there's a social and political dimension to it as well, but it's not the topic today. It's just a project methodology to make it possible to move forward in small steps, in small increments, heading in a certain direction with the acceptance, the full acceptance of the idea that we don't know what the end product or the end software or the end project will look like. Okay, so it's a way to move forward while leaving options open, and while still being in this discovery mood, this openness toward what might be needed and that we have not yet figured out. Okay, because circumstances are changing, because the organization is changing, because the world around the organization is changing as well, because your user, customer, etc., they are changing too. And we want to move forward while being able to adapt to that. Okay. And you will see Scrum has one advantage. Well, actually, it has two. The first one is that it's simple, and the second one, it's kind of fun to practice. Ask Giselle and Blanca; they'll tell you about it. So I was talking about moving forward with the acceptance of the idea that we don't know what we'll need in the future. All the needs, all the features you need, all the expectations you have today are written down in a list of expectations, a list of needs, a list of desires. And this list of needs is called the backlog. It's a list of ideas, proposition, requests, expectations, etc., coming from all over the place, all the stakeholders to the project, the users, the internal users, the external users, the suppliers, the stakeholders of all kinds, etc. Everything that someone in relationship with the project might require will be noted in the backlog. Okay, no judgment, no evaluation at this stage. If there's an idea around, we'll pick it up and we'll put it in the backlog. The only thing we'll take care of at this stage will be to make sure that the idea, the suggestion, what is written down can be understood by any stakeholder of the project. Okay, there's no other judgment being made except the fact that the idea should be understandable for everybody. Okay, a 10-year-old child should be able to understand this, regardless of the complexity of your project. So we make sure that every single idea in the backlog, and there are hundreds of them, is understandable by almost anybody. Okay, and what you will see in DevOps is basically just a long list of ideas, expectations, etc. In Agile, those expectations, those desires are called user stories. And it's kind of a nice way to put it, because that's basically a story that's being told by a user. And usually it's articulated in a very simple way. We use the sentence as someone in a certain role, so as a web user, as a NA staff member, as an event manager, etc. As someone in a certain role, I want something, and you describe what you want, so that, and you explain why you want it. What is the expected benefit? What is the thing that you don't like doing that you can stop doing if this desire is fulfilled, and so on. Okay, so the backlog is just a long list of expectations articulated in this way. As someone in a certain role, I want something so that something else becomes possible or something becomes no longer needed. And that's a backlog, long list of story. And the good thing about it is that it is incomplete, it is partially wrong, and it will never be done in full. And you know that in advance. And it makes it very easy to express the needs in a context where basically there's no judgment made on the needs you will express. There is this openness from the start. Make sense? But then we want to move forward and we want things to get done. And what do you do with a backlog that is incomplete, incorrect, and basically very organic, kind of organized chaos? How do you start from there and then deliver something that's really useful to the end user? Because on top of that, like any other organization or any living being, we have limitations. We can't do it all. We have to make choices. We have to set priorities. And out of the chaos of the backlog, because the stories in the backlog, or at least some of the stories in the backlog, are very clear to everybody, if the question that is being asked is, say you have 2 weeks of work ahead of you, and you are allowed to select stories that can be fulfilled within 2 weeks. You're not going to pick up any story that needs 3 weeks or 6 months to be fulfilled. You will only stick to stories that can be done within the next 2 weeks. It becomes relatively easy to select out of the backlog the few stories that you can start working on and deliver in 2 weeks. Okay, and in Agile, it's called a sprint. It's a short period of time, usually 2-3 weeks, during which you commit to deliver a very limited number of stories that are selected from the backlog. And 2 weeks later, there we go. We have a team of people working on a tool, for instance, that is delivering a limited set of features to the end users. Very limited number of features, very simple features, and they're delivered to the users, and it's the users who are deciding whether they accept the deliverables or not. It's not, it's done, it's yours, and you have to use it. We've figured out a solution for the needs you have expressed. Do you want to start using them? That's the question that's being asked to the users 2-3 weeks later. And it's up to the users to decide whether they pick it up or not. And when that's done, that very small increment of feature is already changing the organization a little bit. And so it's impacting at the same time the needs that are being expressed and the system that the organization is using. And in Agile, after the sprint, we do not just start another sprint directly. We take usually 2-3 hours to retrospect on the effect of on the organization of the feature that have been delivered and the way the project was driven. It's called the retrospective. And only when that's done, then we start a new sprint again. We go back to the backlog, which will have changed in the meantime. New stories that have been removed because no longer needed or no longer relevant for the organization. And we go for another sprint. And that's the way, step by step, sprint by sprint, you're moving forward toward something that makes sense. And that something that makes sense is a kind of cloud, general ID. And every 2 weeks, you get a chance to realize whether the step you've made is taking you in the good direction. And if it's not, okay, you might have lost 2 weeks, but it's not a big deal. You have learned things in the meantime, and you are, correcting the direction you're heading to so that it fits your goals better. Does that make sense, everything I'm saying? It's a little bit theoric, but I think it's worthwhile, clarifying that before jumping to DevOps. So it's more than just a tool that is being presented to you, but it's also a way of working.
Just a question that there might be things that we need that require 6 weeks or, or 2 months to develop. How do they fit in this kind of work?
Well, we will make sure that when something needs more than 2 weeks to be done, it's broken down into smaller chunks that can be done in 2 weeks. Because if that's a bit bigger, it also becomes risky to develop it. How many times have you had something developed that was delivered 1 month or 6 months later, just to figure out that it wasn't what you need, or that you do not longer need it? So if you have something that's big that needs to be done, we'll break it down into smaller chunks and we'll deliver that first. So you can confirm again that it is what you need. And maybe the picture of what you were expecting will change a little bit. And then you have the rest of the sprints to, influence the course. See what I mean? Okay. But it takes practice. You will also realize when you have something that big and you start breaking it down into smaller chunks, it's not the addition of the chunk that takes you there. First of all, usually you realize when you've done 20% of the effort, 80% of what you expected is delivered, and it's no longer valuable to work on the remaining 20%. You will work on the valuable 20% of another topic. And so that's already a better use of your resources. And also you will notice that when it starts being delivered, something else pops up and you will pick it up or change direction or figure out something else. And there's an incredible value that comes, but it's, I mean, I can explain it from a theoretical point of view. It's something you really have to practice to really feel it. It's when you break something down, it's not A plus B plus C equal D or E. It just becomes something different. There's the view on the organization is different. Instead of accumulating steps to draw a flow or to think in terms of diagram flow chart, the features you will figure out will be different. They will be much more reusable. It's an it will no longer be something that needs to fit within a flow. It's going to be a reusable feature that can be used in tons of places. Okay, I don't know, Giselle, it's a little bit theoretical what I am explaining at the moment. Do you have an example in mind, something we've worked on that could illustrate that?
You mean the breaking down into smaller pieces?
Yeah, and the sum of the pieces not being equal to what we have broken down in the first place.
Yeah, that's very philosophical. No, right now I don't have. I was trying to think also of the things we have done already, but
I have the example of project and activities, whereas in the initial description was that you have project, and within these projects there are events and activities, and then we then discussed about it and figured out there was another way to put it that would maybe provide more flexibility. It's to consider that there are only activities and a child-parent relationship between activities. Instead of having project on one end and activities on the other hand, it's all activities, and some of them are related to a kind of mother activity. And it just...
Yeah, true. That's a good example. So if I use the names of these projects, Pavo, for instance, we were discussing with Olivier the difference between projects like the snacks, so these big projects where we have a number of activities in it, and whether we should make the difference between project and activities, knowing that the colleagues use words interchangeably, so that this would be very confusing in the platform if we start having both. So in the end, it's true, we have decided that there we only speak about activities, but they can be connected to a parent process, which would be Snack DG, for instance, or Yent, or whatever other bigger project that we could talk about. And yeah, that's a good example, Olivier. Yeah.
Good, I like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in fact, I'll come back to the slide. There's the product backlog. I don't know if you see my mouse moving on the screen so that I can highlight what I'm talking about. There's this product, the product backlog on the left, which is the long list of expectations you have toward something, toward the project. And that product backlog is the start of a smaller backlog, the sprint backlog. That's the small selection of items we'll be working on for a short period of time. And this loop you have there is this short period of time, typically 2-3 weeks. And at the end of this loop, at the end of this sprint, there's a deliverable, which is the product or an increment of some kind, an addition of feature being added to the features that were already existing before. And that's the additional added value that's being delivered by the project every 2-3 weeks. And in purple, you have the meetings that are organized before and after the sprint. Before the sprint, there's the sprint planning, which is the meeting during which the people working on the project, the Scrum team, is selecting the stories they will deliver 2 weeks later. It's called the planning. And at the end of the sprint, there's a review together with the user so that the solutions are presented to the users. The users accept or do not accept the delivery of the solutions. And we take the time during the sprint retrospective to see what's been going on during the sprint so that we can, use the learnings before we start another sprint. Make sense? And basically that is Scrum. There's nothing more and nothing less in Scrum than what you have here on the screen. Very simple. It's basically, there's an elephant ahead of you. And you're not going to swallow the elephant at once. You're going to break it down into pieces, and you will reevaluate after every single spoon of piece of elephant whether it tastes good enough for you or not.
I have a question regarding the roles.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me it's a bit unclear who is taking which role, or yeah,
thanks for the question. I did not really cover that. The roles are the people you see at the bottom of the slide. And the terminology is kind of old-fashioned. It dates back from the 90s, so it's not really relevant, but it's still in use. The product owner, and it's really an unfortunate name because it's not necessarily a product, and the poor guy there doesn't really own anything, but still the product owner is the guy or the team collecting the stories from the users. Okay, so they're the one writing down the stories, the expectations in the backlog. And it's really a job. I mean, it's active listening at its best. It's, I do not understand what you're saying, but my duty is to transcript it in the backlog and make sure it's understandable by everybody. So could you please rephrase? Could you please explain? Could you please show me? These are the typical questions that the product owner would ask, so that every single story that goes into the backlog is fully understandable by anybody within the organization. The worst thing that could happen within an organization is that, for instance, the accountant is expressing need that the person in charge of communication does not understand, or the other way around. And that's the very first duty of the product owner. It's to write down the stories, and by doing so, write a story as a whole that is understandable by anybody within the organization. And it's almost also philosophical, but at the very least, it's very organizational. I mean, where is an organization heading to if a department does not understand what the other department is asking for, or a person does not understand what a colleague is asking for, or a supplier is not understanding what a customer is asking for, and the other way around. Okay, so that's the very first role. Okay, well, the first one, it's one of the roles. There's no first and second role. Yeah. Okay, but that's probably where everything starts. Its needs are written down in a way that makes them understandable for the organization as a whole. Okay, and in a way that connects to the goal and the reason for being of the organization and so on. And then we get going. Someone will start working on it. And that's the other role. It's a Scrum team. It's basically the group of people who will do stuff. It's the group of people that select stories at the beginning of a sprint and commit to deliver a solution for them at the end of the sprint. Okay, and there's a rule in Scrum, it's that the team should never be more than 9 people. Because we see that teams beyond or above 9 people do not work properly. 9 people is the level of, is the size of team that is required to have a team that has enough intimacy to deliver things that make sense while having fun doing it. If it's a bigger team, it's not going to work. If it's a smaller team, the reliability of the team may also be questioned. So the ideal Scrum team is between 6 and 9 people. Okay, if you have a project involving hundreds or thousands of developers, you break them down into teams of 9 people. Okay, so that's the second role, people doing the stuff, delivering it, and then hearing at the end of the sprint whether what they've delivered was useful to the organization or not. And then there's a third role that became a role in its own right in the 90s when the project managers were wondering, or the managers were wondering what to do in an agile environment. They figured out, this kind of process needs a coach. It needs someone that is not doing anything but listening to the team and questioning the team about the way they work. And this coaching duty is called Scrum Master. So it's basically the guy or the lady doing nothing but sitting together with the team and questioning the way they deal with the business. And in the very first agile approach, this was a rotating role taken by someone from one of the 2 other roles. But then that's where the project manager got worried for their jobs, and they invented this role of Scrum Master, which became a permanent role. But I think to understand the essence of it, it's useful to remember that this used to be a rotating role between the people really working in the project. Okay, does that make things clearer, Blanca?
Yes, it does. I mean, I automatically go into, okay, who's doing what? So my understanding is that whether it's this project or whether it's the website, we are the project owners, Scrum team are the developers, and I assume you are our Scrum Master?
I'm kind of acting as the Scrum Master.
Yeah.
You are kind of acting as a product owner at this stage, and you are all acting kind of users, stakeholders. So by default, everybody here in the call will be a user. And it's a role that's actually not on the slide because it's obvious. Everybody has the right to express needs. It's also expected from you. You have the right and the freedom to express your needs. And someone will pick them up and write them down in the backlog. Together, that someone is Blanca, Giselle, Rita, myself, Katarina as well, and so on. We are acting as product owners for the moment. And you have selected suppliers, Lucid and so on, and Ukes, etc., to join you, to constitute the Scrum team, the group of people that will be working on the tools that will deliver features, etc. Okay?
Makes sense, thank you.
But in the longer run, that's going to be a question that will have to be officially asked within your organization. Who's product owner? For what project? And who are the team members? Who are the Scrum members? Where is the Scrum team? And you can have external people helping you as product owner. That's more or less what I'm doing at the moment, together with you, Giselle, and so on. And you will also have people from the outside helping you in the Scrum team, because they will bring the technical expertise and the experience and so on. And the more you want to add towards a minimum of autonomy on the tools and a minimum of ability to administer and develop the tools by yourself, the more you will have internal people involved in the Scrum team as well. Okay. And I mean, the whole project relies on the balance between these two teams, and the energy bounce back and forth all the time between these two teams. A team that's working on the needs and not even forbidding itself to think about potential solution, strictly focusing on needs. And why do they refrain themselves from thinking about the solution? Because if you think you have the solution, or you know how to solve it, that will influence the way you listen to the needs and the way you write down the needs. And the same if you have the technical expertise to come up with a solution. If you are collecting the needs, that will also have an influence. So that's the reason why you are splitting it into separate teams. And it's the harmony, the synergy, the good intelligence between these two teams that makes a successful project. Okay, one team focusing on the needs, the other team focusing on solutions. Make sense? Okay, well, that was a long theoretical explanation. Let's now jump to, yeah, we'll need to stop the screen sharing and switch to another one. There we go. No, it's not a good one. Where's my DevOps? There we go. That's the one. Okay. So DevOps is a Microsoft tool that used to be for developers, and then expanded and became something broader for project management, but it also deals with the technical aspect of it. Whenever there's a feature that is being delivered, the coders are now making an explicit link between the piece of code they've written or the piece of customization they've done and the story it was originating from. So every step forward in an IT project is really broken down into small steps, and those steps are the stories in the backlog. And every single piece of code is referenced with the story it's originating from. So we have an exact track record of how the software has evolved. and that makes it possible to deal with much larger teams of developers, have the history of the development of the tool, roll back whenever there's an issue, and understand where the tool is coming from, which is very useful for new developers, for instance, if they join the team. And we have two projects going on at the moment, the cooperation platform and the website. Let's take the cooperation platform as an example. And in the board, there's a long list of work items. Work items is the other name for user stories, okay? And so I'll just take the first one as an example. As a NA staff member, I need to access pedagogical material of knowledge management and staff training. Okay, that's a need. The reason why this need is expressed is that the NA staff members can then plan any hosting activity following the principle and quality criteria of the conceptualized staff training, KMST. I can't remember having written down that one, but that's a good problem.
Olivier,
yeah.
I think these are the things that we actually did together. And for the TCA net to know, because actually we're starting number one, but the number one is the least, in a way, not important, but fitting with the platform, because there's a little part of the platform dedicated to KMST, especially to the activities that will follow the same process as TCA net. But that's just a small part of the overall.
So it's not a good
stories.
example, but it's a good example of.
It's not a bad example, but it's yeah.
But it's a good example of the fact that we really write down everything that is flying by. Okay, as long as it can be properly articulated. And we also tag it. And in this case, it's tagged with NA staff. So it's expressed by a staff member from a national agency, and it relates to activities. And because we tag it properly, it makes it possible to deal with a backlog containing hundreds of stories and have all those stories grouped together using these tags. Okay. So if you want to see all the stories that are related to contracts, there you go. You have 3 of them. And if you click here, they open up. Okay, it makes it possible to deal with backlogs containing tons of stories, hundreds of stories. If you go back to the backlog, do you have any other example that you'd like to comment, Giselle?
No, I would need to go through the list.
This one maybe. As an NA staff member, I want to receive the report of an event to which I have sent participants. Okay, and it relates to surveys. And there's no description of why this story is useful, why it is needed. Okay, so that's not good. This explanation should be there. I'll take another example. Allocate a project task to a person in charge. Again, no description, no indication why that is useful, but here we have something interesting. It's an acceptance criteria. It's a condition that's been set in advance to clarify to the Scrum team what condition the solution they'll come up with will have to satisfy in order for the solution to be accepted. And the condition here is that if you want to allocate a project task to a person, this person should be part of the list of people involved in the project in the first place. You cannot allocate a project task to someone who's not playing any role with the project. Okay, it kind of makes sense.
Olivier, what you're saying now is that it means that for every single story, ideally we need a description and possibly a criteria that would justify the.
A description is always good and always useful because it will help the people working on the tool to really understand from within the need that's being expressed. If I'm saying as an accountant, I need to see whether an invoice has been paid. Okay, I can imagine what the steps will be if the invoice is not paid, but I can only imagine. Okay, and as an accountant, I could need an indication of whether an invoice is paid or not for tons of reasons. And if it is to send reminder, the solution I'll be getting is not the same compared to the same need that would have been expressed in order to manage my cash flow, for instance, for which I might need a dashboard, not a mechanism to send reminders to the customer. Okay.
Yeah.
Having said that, in some cases, the need is so basic, so self-sufficient that, okay, you will not bother to provide a motivation for it. And the acceptance criteria is not mandatory. It's just to save time on the Scrum team. Whenever you know in advance that there are conditions that needs to be met, well, you save the time of the Scrum team by mentioning it in advance. And so they know, and they know what they have to take into account before they come up with a solution. There we go. That's an example of a very basic story that maybe does not really require a description, or so that I want to change the status of a project task. In the acceptance criteria, I'm setting the potential values for this status of project tasks. Do I need to clarify why I need that? Probably not. Okay, or if there was a need, that would probably be done. So the question is, if you were in the Scrum team, would you pick up that story in a sprint? Is it clear enough? Or are you taking a risk to come up with a solution for something because that's potentially unclear? Okay, and here in this case, it's probably good enough. It's probably safe enough for you to pick it up and onboard it in the sprint. Make sense?
Yep.
What you also see here is that there's a relationship between stories. Not really a dependency, because we try to avoid that, but a relationship. And in this case, this idea of managing the status of project tasks led to the idea of setting a deadline for a project task. And so these are two related stories. And related doesn't really mean much, apart from the fact that the ideas or the need emerged more or less together. So they kind of related. Okay, but it's just an indication of the context for the Scrum team, nothing more. If there are dependencies, for instance, that story, there's no use to work on it until another story is done, it's okay, and it will be written down as well, but we try to avoid this kind of relationships because they may act as a, they might block the project. And if there's a dependency, as a product owner, I'll try to work on removing that dependency instead of just noting it, so that the whole project becomes more fluid, so that the approach becomes more systemic. If there's a dependency between two needs, it's probably because there's a flow somewhere that's kind of frozen. And it would be potentially good to unfreeze this flow so that there are no more conditions. The organization may do whatever it wants. It's fluid. And so we'll try to break down the dependencies. It's not always possible, but at least there's energy available from the product owners to remove those dependencies so that the whole project becomes more fluid. It's hard to do agile without being philosophic, don't you think? Okay.
It's nice when you can turn things like this into philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Prepare the contracts for the trainers, another easy one. So easy, there's no description again. Okay, and that's related to NA staff. So it's the NA staff that needs to prepare the contract, and it's tagged with contracts. Okay, so if I want to see everything that's being said about contracts, let's say we're having a workshop on contracts at Salto. What do we know about contracts so far? We need to produce a cooperation agreement between the NAs that are co-funding a project. And we need to produce a OP agreement between Salto and NAs that will be using the OP platform for a project. And we need to prepare the contract for the trainers. What else is needed in terms of contract? And that would be the question asked at the beginning of a workshop on contracts. And probably at the end of the workshop, there will be 10, 20, 30, 50 more stories specifying how you want contracts to be dealt with on the platform. Okay. Something I've not covered yet, you might have seen some stories that have a different icon, like this one. Manage the P&L of a project. Manage a project content and pedagogic goals. What else do we have? Have guidelines about the use of the platform for new TCNet officers. These are epics. And epics are themes, topics, midterm, long-term goals we want to fulfill. Okay, so they are not stories because there's nothing you can do within 2 weeks to come up with a complete solution to manage the P&L of a project. Okay, managing the P&L of a project is a topic. It's not something you can deliver. But if you want to go toward a tool where you can manage the P&L of a project, there are several things that needs to be done. Consolidate the budget, define a budget, set the level of funding, etc., etc. 3 stories at this stage. And those 3 stories are contributing to this epic. Okay, so epic is a way to set the vision you have. You're not just working on a backlog containing hundreds of stories and it's chaos and there's no vision and we don't know what we're adding. And every 2 weeks we have to reinvent the wheel again and figure out again where we want to go to. No, there has been discussion, separate discussion about that. And this has been noted as epics, midterm, long-term goals. And so whenever the question that is asked to the user, the question, what do you need, is being asked, it will somehow connect to the epics that have been identified. And in this case, for the cooperation platform, let's see what epics have been listed. 3 of them at this stage, still very raw, not yet refined and reformulated. Managing the P&L of a project, managing the content of a project, and guidelines for new TCNet officers. Okay, there are probably tons of other epics that are worthwhile mentioning. At this stage, these are the 3 epics that have been identified. And again, they can serve as the starting point for a workshop. The purpose of the workshop being to explore the needs that would help to manage the P&L of a project, manage the content, and so on. So typically, epics would be topics that would be surveyed, reconsidered, discussed, evaluated every month, every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, so that it gives a meaning to the work that's being done on the backlog. It's a very funny thing to do within an organization. You ask manager what they need, and they'll usually start telling you about dashboards and reports because they want to see KPIs, they want to see where we're adding to, etc., and they will articulate epics. And when you ask to the people doing the stuff what they need, they will come up with really down-to-earth practical things they need to have their job done quicker and or better. And these are the 2 levels we are managing in an agile project: epics and stories. And also very often you notice there are epics coming from the manager. There's no way you can translate them into something practical. They're empty, they are like hot air. And also very often there's a lot of information coming back from the field with very pragmatic, down-to-earth needs that do not connect to any epics because those issues or those targets or those opportunities have not been identified by the management. It's not that the epics are better than stories or stories are better than the epics. It's the flow between the 2 that makes sense within an organization. And we have this double-sided view on the organization: the helicopter view on epics and the down-to-earth, practical, directly attainable dimension of it at the level of user stories. Make sense? Even though it's something we are just beginning to explore in this particular project.
I think Paavo has a question, Olivier.
Yeah, I'm not seeing him. I don't. Yeah, Paavo?
Yeah, I'm just concerned about the actual process on how we're gonna do it now with the first glance. I mean, I understand the concept and all of it, and but then I'm worried about all these stories with no descriptions, and and I know that there are meetings with you, but are we supposed to work like unsynchronized? And if we do, what it sounds like a mess, because I think that we might disagree. Or can you, well, just
okay.
Yeah.
It's actually a good question, because it will give me the opportunity to clarify the process. For instance, I'll take, you see there's a status for the stories, and most of them are approved, but there are some new stories among them. And I'll take a new story somewhere here. Oops. Collect reimbursement request via printed form and physical proof of expense. Okay, it's a new story. Why is it new? Because it's not yet fully qualified. And there was a comment here, we need to investigate if there are actually any country-specific requirement at all. And we have two options. So in other words, there's still an ongoing discussion on this need. We're not sure it's a need that makes sense, or we're not sure it's properly articulated. Consequence being that it remains a new need, it's not yet approved. Okay, so coming back to the question you asked, the more there are IDs and requests coming into the backlog, the better. The thing is, people acting as product owner need to identify them so that they can be double checked, and so that we can make sure it's consistent with the rest of the backlog, and that it's expressed in a way that's understandable for others. So that this is where this status will help. New stories are welcome, and they will be worked on by the product owner so that they become approved. Approved meaning they are properly tagged, there's a motivation for it, we figure out whether there are acceptance criteria, and so on. And if needed, there will be a conversation underneath the story asking for clarification. Okay.
Ines has a question too.
Yeah, just to finish on what Pavo has asked, the consequence of it being that sometimes stories will be, duplicate one another. One of the story will be removed, the formulation of the story will be refined, and so on. The stories will be associated with one another as a result of those conversations. Does that answer your question, Pavo? Because that was an interesting point you raised.
Partly, but go on.
Sorry, I didn't understand what you said.
Partly, yeah. I'm still like, the actual work that we are required to do. That's
okay. Maybe I'll let Giselle or Blanca respond to that, but my answer would be, at the very least, you're all users of the platform. Yes. And so as such, your ideas and needs are most welcome, and they will come into the backlog as new stories. And
okay, so just to clarify it in the very simple language, that if we see a need, we can add it.
Yes.
It means that we have to go through all the, how many hundred and...
You don't have to, just express the needs, and because it will be the job of the product owner. And that's something interesting. I really like the job of product owner, because whenever there are two duplicates, if you look at them close enough, you will notice they are not duplicates. They seem to tell the same story, but one is expressed from someone in a certain role looking at a certain dimension, while the other person was looking at something else in a slightly different context. And so those two apparently duplicate stories are actually telling two different stories. And the consequence might be that the two stories are removed from the backlog, but that they lead to 10 other stories.
That's the other question, maybe, sorry, Ines, before you go, that it may be hard to recognize the level. You would say that we still express whatever we want to express, and then later we can see if it has to be broken down into smaller bits. Or
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies
a lot. As product owners, we are very happy with chaos. We think chaos is a positive thing out of which something can emerge. So please help us and bring chaos into the backlog.
We need your kind of people in the NA.
Ines?
Yeah, I had two questions, and my first one was very much related to what Pavel was saying. So I think indeed this chaos, I think it's something we need to deal with it, because we always think very much already in flows and step by step. If I understand you well, we have to let it go for the moment and just come up with as many stories as we see that we need. So I think that's a bit of shift in our way of approaching and thinking, which is interesting, I think. So that's clear now to me, that we first collect and collect and collect. But then I was wondering, for instance, very concretely now with this 56 that you were showing, does the system also allow that steps are different between NAs? Can you also differentiate, or do we have to come to a kind of consensus in the stories?
No, you don't have to come to a consensus. And again, that's the beauty of the PO work. There will be elements of some process that will be common to all NAs, and some elements of what you at the moment call the same process that will be different between NAs. And it's fair enough, because NAs are coming from different countries. They might have different habits or different regulations, etc. And what the PO, what the product owner will really try to do is try to have a systemic view on it, look at it from a distance. And basically, if you ask the product owner the definition of an exception will be something like a rule that has not yet been discovered. And that's the way the product owner will deal with that. They will try to see if there's a bigger rule, or from a meta perspective, if there's something that can be figured out that helps dealing with those exceptions and specificities. And if there isn't, there isn't. And there will be stories that are specific for a country and stories that are general for everybody. And DevOps is able to deal with that. For instance, you have tons of fields such as the area, which can help breaking down the backlog into a kind of common trunk, common backlog for all NAs. And then there's the Belgian and Italian and Slovakian part of the backlog, and it's fair enough.
Okay.
And if your way of thinking today is in terms of flow and diagrams, perfect, let it come as it is.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Maybe I can also add, at the moment if you walk through, you will see a lot of stories that come from this Excel document that Tinkara had prepared. So we used also this as a basis. So there are stories in that document that Olivier has been inputting in DevOps, which are not relevant for us. They go too much into the way the Slovenian NA is dealing with things, but we still left them at the moment in DevOps, in line with this log for chaos that Olivier was mentioning. But in case you wonder, some of the stories, they didn't come from the meetings we had with Katarina and Rita, but also from existing documents that some colleagues are using to plan their process.
Okay, so I think all the people in the room have no access to DevOps, right? Correct?
I just gave to Gris and Barbara. I think the others had access already.
Okay, so basically, whenever there's an ID popping up in your head, just go here plus new product backlog item, and there you go. I need this so that whatever reason you have in mind, conditions, if any. And that's already good enough. You can save and close. It will be picked up by the product owners. Okay. If there's any, let me hide this. If there's any related file, you can attach it here, and that's it. The relationship between stories will be here, and a conversation will potentially follow with special questions. I know it's not really a question, but it's just another example. Okay, and Blanca will receive a notification asking her or telling her I need to know more. Okay, and that conversation will keep going until it's clear enough for the product owner, in which case the story will then be marked as approved, ready for sprint.
And this is what Olivier just showed in discussion. This is important to keep track, because this is also where Lucid is asking their questions. If something is not clear and so on, then they tag us, and they so normally they tag mostly Olivier, Rita, and me so far, but that's where they tag us for clarification or for uploading an example or a file or things like that.
What we will introduce at some point is we will name someone as the person in charge for this story. That might be the person who came up with the idea in the first place, or the person who expressed the need. And that will be the person who will be in charge of validating the solution that the Scrum team is coming up with. Okay. So for the cooperation platform, the main provider being Lucid. Lucid, let's imagine it's Blanca requesting this. Blanca will be asked whether the solution Lucid is coming with is good enough to fulfill our needs. And that's the condition for the feature to be accepted at the end of the sprint. Does that make sense? So accepting a feature means I will use it. Okay, if you don't think you're going to use it, you do not accept the delivery of the feature. We don't want a tool that's filled with features that nobody's using. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. The development section will be the section where the provider, Lucid and so on, will make the link I was referring to a few minutes ago, the link to the piece of code that is specifically addressing this particular feature. So you have complete traceability on the code and the customization. You have questions?
Barbara has a question.
I have maybe a simple one, but so we don't need to have an overview on what is already there, and we don't need to double check if the question or the need we expressed is already covered. Did I understand that right?
Yeah, that's correct. You don't have to, but you're free to do it as well if you want. And probably the easiest way to do that is to go to use the tags. I'm bothered by my Zoom window here. Save change. If you let's say you have an idea about, I don't know, contracts or activities or calls, whatever, you can go to the tags here and click on the topic that seems to be related with the story you have in mind. If that's funding, for instance, you see there are only 3 stories talking about funding at this stage. It's probably not enough to describe what needs to happen on the funding front for Salto. So you will figure out what's already expressed and maybe add an idea of your own on top of that. Or comment on an existing idea. It's more than welcome too. If you see an idea that doesn't make sense for you, well, just go and comment it and say that doesn't make sense for me. And that's useful too. Because the next question will be what would make sense for you? And there might be 10 stories hidden behind it. Make sense?
I think Ines has a question too.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's a very stupid question, but does this backlog exercise end at a certain point? Because in the beginning you said this is incomplete, we cannot know what will happen. So does it mean that this is an ongoing process where we can still say in 1 year, we forgot a few important stories, still want to add them? Or do we have to agree now on a certain point where we all said now for us the list of stories is complete in the way it can be complete? Not clear for me yet.
What would you prefer?
I would prefer that we can still have on the way when we see a new need, or I don't know. I try to figure it out what it would mean then for the next part of my use.
If you want to continue and keep the ability to come up with the idea that will show up in 1 year, so let it be. Go ahead, continue. And yes, please see it as a continuous improvement process as opposed to seeing it as a project.
Okay.
That's also the essence of it. Escape from the go live and the big trainings and the tools that are exactly what we need, etc. There's no such thing as something that is exactly what we need. It's changing all the time. It's a process. So yes, it's there to stay. And that's also the reason why I'm helping, is to establish this ongoing process. And as soon as it is established, then you don't need me anymore and you continue on your own. Any other question? Do you feel empowered to go to the backlog over the coming hours, days, weeks, and add IDs to, yeah?
Just maybe I feel empowered. It feels nice to just wish for things. I'm still maybe a bit confused about, is there a structure, like, you know, do we need to meet at times, or and how does it go, or do we, are there time like I don't know, deadlines when you have to do something? I still don't, sorry, somehow understand this.
Yeah, no, these are valid questions. The work will be a combination of being together at the same time and working, you know, from a distance through commands and so on. So that will be a combination of both. At the moment, we are doing workshops to collect the IDs and to initiate the backlog. But also IDs will keep, it will be a constant flow of IDs coming in all over at all times. And those incoming comments will be dealt with through comments and so on. And whenever there's an opportunity to do so, or whenever the topic requires it, there will be a dedicated workshop on a specific topic or to describe a specific process and so on, as often as required. That's more or less how things are tackled. Combination of synchronous and asynchronous work.
D'accord.
And you were asking if there were deadlines, etc. Well, I guess, yes, there are, and they're probably coming from the outside, because you have, I don't know what super organization that requires you to have that done within a certain time frame, etc. So you're also subject to deadlines coming from the outside, and they will be taken into account, usually at EPIC level. We need to be, I don't know, GDPR compliant by the 25th May of 2019, something like that. That would have been an example of external deadline. You might have internal deadlines as well. We had a look at the EPICs. The EPICs are basically the foundation for a roadmap. If you have 10 EPICs, 10 midterm, long-term goals, how do you put them on a calendar? What do you want to tackle this quarter? What do you want to have achieved by the end of the year? And by putting the EPICs on the timeline, you also help setting priorities in the backlog, because you will only tackle the stories that are contributing to the EPICs that are on the roadmap at the moment. Okay. Maybe another bit of information I can add so that you really see the picture of where we are now. Both for the web project and for the cooperation platform, we are more or less at the same situation with the providers. The providers have access to the backlog, and they will decide when the backlog is good enough for them to start working. So the pressure is on us at the moment to come up with a backlog that is good enough for the supplier to get started and starting to code without taking too much risk. The risk being that the stories they deliver is not accepted at the end of the sprint. So they expect clarification and clarity from us out of the chaos. Can you imagine? But that's where we are. And that's the kind of relationship we are starting to establish with them. We are their supplier. We supply them with a backlog that must be clear enough for them to start working without taking risk. And so they're asking questions, they're challenging the backlog at the moment. They're coming up with things that is unclear to them. And usually they have good reasons to do so, because that's unclear for us as well, or at least for me. Okay. Barbara?
I have another maybe a stupid question, but I looked at the tags and just to be sure that we're talking about the same things. When there is a tag activity, and activities are, for instance, what we understand under the TCA net activities, right? Yeah.
Yes, there are also a description actually of what we mean, but I don't think we made it already for activities.
Maybe what we can introduce, Giselle, is the data model. All the tags you see in DevOps are developed further in this Google Sheet. And that's maybe also something you should have access to. And so, for instance, what is an activity? An activity is something with a name that has a format that might have a parent activity that has a language that is applicable for some countries and regions, covering certain topics, targeting some specific target groups, related to some key action, that has a certain form, that is hosted somewhere, that has a related venue, that has a short and a long description, that has a start and an end date. That's an activity. And that will encompass training courses, seminar surveys, conferences, and so on.
And yes, I can give access to the data model. So this is in a way the basis of the structure that we try to apply to DevOps. Just for you to know, we are playing with it at the moment. So we're testing every logic. So you will see a lot of things that are connected to ETS and so on. And it's not to give predominance, but it's because we're trying with things we know. And there was something else I wanted to say, but I forgot now. It will come back.
Okay. So
and the tags that are in green, you might not see well in the screen sharing now, but the tags that are marked in green are normally the ones that we believe are functioning well enough now to follow that logic in DevOps. Yeah. Sorry, Olivier.
Does that answer your question, Barbara? Yeah.
I'll give you all access to that too.
Any
but
other
then
question?
yes, then the question that would come is, do they need to do anything in the data model? So to be very clear also, who is working on it?
There's no, I would say there's no expectation for anybody to do so. Just maybe useful that you see what's going on when we are in the process of defining what is an activity, what is a contact, what is an organization, what is a role in an activity, and so on. Okay, and I'll use the example of a role, for instance, because that's quite interesting. It relates an activity taken from the list of activity, and an organization or a contact is playing a certain role within that activity, and that has a description and potentially a start date and an end date and a status as well. Okay.
Actually, Olivier, if you can make the file editable, I can simply share the link afterwards with the group. But you are the owner, so not necessarily now, but
yeah. Well, transferring ownership is not possible in Google.
No. You just make that everybody that has the link.
Okay. Yeah, I'll invite everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. Okay. Okay. Any other question for the sake of your empowerment?
When's the next time we are supposed to meet, if we're supposed to meet?
Well, I don't know about that. The purpose of the call today was to give you some insight about the project and the way it's being dealt with and the tools we're using to work on the project. Well, I don't know if you have an official answer for that, but I would say, I mean, my personal answer would be, I'm curious to see what it inspires you and what potential envy it might trigger from your end to participate or not, or to be involved or not. We are recruiting POs and team members.
I'm already writing things that I'm inspired, but I also know that this is just one of the jobs that I have to do, and a deadline can be a trigger in the sense that when you go back to your normal work and you forget that this exists, then you know that you will come back and maybe read things and get inspired and things like that. So that's why I'm asking. And what was the other thing that I wanted to say? Well, maybe there's none. So that's what I wanted to say.
A little tip or indication as a reaction to what you just said, because there's normal life, and then this is somehow the ideal life or the ideal look on the platform, etc., and might feel disconnected, especially if you're under pressure at the office. So I would be tempted to propose it as a kind of stress therapy for you. As soon as you feel under pressure, especially when you feel you're losing time, then express the idea that comes to mind and put it in the backlog. And that's a kind of, you know, how do you say that, soupape de sécurité, a kind of safety valve. When you're pissed off, bored, or annoyed in one way or another, there's something else behind it, an idea, a potential progress. Take the time to write it down. That will feel good. You will get your kick of dopamine, or I don't know which hormone, or and well, that might be a partial solution to the daily stress you're experiencing at the office. And at least there's this that will be your little contribution to a project that is meant to help you save time on things you do on a daily basis. And so that becomes a trigger also. If the idea you have is not helping to save time, and we can be as basic as that in the beginning, then if there's no time saving behind it, okay, you may remain in your daily work. But if you think it makes sense for the organization as a whole, it might be a relief for you as well to take a few seconds or minutes to write it down. And you will see it's being picked up as well, which feels very satisfying, both for the people receiving your contribution and for you for making the contribution.
I think Gri has also, I have something to add to that, but maybe Gri.
Okay.
Yes, I had a question, a very concrete question that you might also have mentioned, but this was a lot of information for me to take in so early in the morning.
On a Monday, can you imagine?
Yes, exactly. And but for instance, I see one of these stories, or what were they called, stories? Anyway, one of these things on the list was to get that you could get a list of participants sent from your country. And if that was my idea, I don't need to put it there because it's already there, that's fine. But if I also want to say that, but I think it should be selected, it should be able to sort on year.
Yeah.
Not only can I add it, should I add it as a comment on the already existed one, or doesn't that matter? I just put it.
You do whatever seems most appropriate for you, and do not bother too much. If you make it a comment and we want to make it a separate story, that will happen. If you make it a separate story and that will be used to enrich an existing story and your original story will be removed, it's fine too. So don't bother. Do whatever feels the most natural for you.
That's easy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And so to build perhaps on Paavo's question about so what's next, yeah, indeed, there's the encouragement to bring more chaos into DevOps, contributing with stories and comments, and so that would be a huge help. The other possibility is, as you know, to support when we meet with Lucid. So except this week and the next week, in principle, we have meetings every Monday at 3 o'clock. These will be the meetings where we check with Lucid what's going on, if things are going fine, It's mostly also for Olivier to play a role there, but I don't know what you think, Olivier, but the idea is also that if members of the working group, not all of us, because that would be too much, but if, and anyway, we won't be able to always be all together at the same time. That's not the idea, but that there are always at least a or two TCA net representatives in those meetings, because if it's just Olivier, myself, for instance, and Lucid, I don't have a whole TCA net perspective. So it's very important in those meetings that there's always somebody. Until now, Rita and Katarina were trying hard to be present each time, but that's exactly where we need help as well, because it's just not possible that it's always like that. So that's the other possibility to get involved in the process when you have time, and or Olivier, right? Or
Yeah, sure. Make sure your voice is being heard, and then the resulting features will be in the backlog and will be served at some point.
So there's a meeting this Wednesday where we will be present, we being at least Rita, myself, I don't know Katarina, but Olivier, and of course Lucid, since they are inviting. But if one of you wants to join already, that's of course okay. We don't have the meeting yet for next week, and after that, as I said, it's every Monday at 3 o'clock. But you don't need to say now. It's to share the information. And there's a question on the chat from Gris, if we can suggest new tags.
Sure. Yes, please go ahead. And again, the product owner will pick it up and come with some feedback on that.
Anything else?
How do you propose new tags?
You simply enter them and they will be added to the list.
In your,
yeah.
What was it called?
So you click on plus here and whatever tag.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
And that's it.
Okay.
There might be a question of access right. If you get a message saying you're not allowed to create tags or something like that, just let us know and we'll sort it out. Giselle, the last word?
No, I think Pavel still has something.
I added a tag and it says the current user does not have permissions to create tags.
Okay, so we'll have to figure that out.
Yeah, I think in terms of types and profile, DevOps for me is still a mystery. They're like all the people who requested access, I don't get the notification in DevOps. I just get it by email and I cannot activate that. So I have to re-invite everybody. And I think they get in as simple team member or stakeholders. So I'm not sure about the level of intervention they can have, but you're also an admin, Olivier, now, so perhaps we can have a look.
Okay, yeah. That. If you get blocked anywhere, just send us an email or a comment on the story you have created, etc. I mean, the entry point is not really relevant. It's going to be picked up anyway.
Okay. If there's no other question at the moment, I can only suggest to play with it a bit. Olivier is right. When you're really into it, it's actually fun. But it's even funnier with when you do that with somebody who knows DevOps by heart, which is not my case. But it's interesting to see the big picture being built. So that's quite motivating. But obviously, it's true, Pavel. Once we will stop this Zoom and get back to our email and so on, that we tend to forget that this file exists. But yeah, the only way to get the things moving is to build it. Sorry. So yeah, that's the encouragement I can give. And yeah, the more we will be in, the easier it gets anyway. So that's a bit the logic of it as well. Yeah. So yeah, have a look, play with it. If anybody wants to join on Wednesday at 2 o'clock, let me know. Just send me a mail and I will make sure that Lucid adds you to the invitation. So if you want to also know how meetings with Lucid works, and I think that's what I can say so far.
Blanca, is there anything you would like to add? The web project being managed in a similar way?
Sorry, can you please repeat?
I was asking if there was anything you wanted to add, because the web project is being managed in a similar way. So,
well, talking about the development of the new website, not for now, as it will be another group of colleagues involved in that. Yeah, I'm not keen on chaos, so I think I need to readjust my attitude towards that.
It's the best invitation you can have. Yeah. Olivier, do you have anything to add?
Well, there's nothing that I think I've forgotten, but if I have, it will come to my mind when the code is closed, of course. So, but I have your email address, so I know where to find you, and you know where to find us as well, and namely that's in DevOps. So, again, just if you simply consider that whenever you lose time, there's a place where you can drop ID so that you don't save time, you don't lose time in the future. That's already very satisfying for me. And so please contribute with any ID you might have. It's going to be picked up, and then again, I think it was a question coming from Ines. This is an ongoing improvement process. If you don't have time now, it's not a problem. That will happen anyway. It's not going to block anything. If you can contribute, that's perfect. And if you cannot contribute now, you will have the opportunity to contribute later. It's not a big deal. So there's no pressure. But if you have room to participate, to contribute, yes, please be welcome to do so.
Okay, then I think we will close now. Thank you all for the time and the interest. Yeah, indeed, Pavel. And thank you, Olivier, for walking us through DevOps. I will stop the recording, but I will also stop the meeting because I have another meeting half an hour ago. And I wish you a great week and great day. And as you can see, this project took a while to start, but now it's there. So that's also really cool. Yeah, indeed. So thank you.
Have a good week.
Thank you. I finally understand what Agile is about. I was looking for many years in my life.
Yeah, I feel so IT.
Learn something on a Monday morning. Yes.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Okay. See you around, people.
You guys.
Bye.
Bye, guys.